supported by the 2019-20 Hong Kong protests, also known as the Anti-Extradition Law Amendment Bill movement, were a series of protests in Hong Kong in response to the introduction of the Fugitive Offenders Amendment Bill by the Hong Kong government. The bill would have allowed extradition to jurisdictions with which Hong Kong did not have extradition agreements, including mainland China and Taiwan. This led to concerns that Hong Kong residents and visitors would be exposed to the legal system of mainland China, which citizens believed would undermine Hong Kong's autonomy and infringe on civil liberties. The protests began with a sit-in at the government headquarters on 15 March 2019 and a demonstration attended by hundreds of thousands on 9 June 2019, followed by a gathering outside the Legislative Council complex to stall the bill's second reading on 12 June, which eventually escalated into violence. On 16 June, just one day after the Hong Kong government suspended the bill, an even bigger protest took place to push for its complete withdrawal and in reaction to the perceived excessive use of force by the Hong Kong police force on 12 June. As the protests progressed, activists laid out 5 key demands, namely the withdrawal of the bill, an investigation into alleged police brutality and misconduct, the release of all the arrested, a retraction of the official characterization of the protests as riots, and the resignation of Carrie Lam as chief executive along with the introduction of universal suffrage in the territory. Police in action when suspected triad members assaulted protesters and commuters in Wen Long on 21 July and the police storming of Prince Edward Station on 31 August further escalated the protests. Lam withdrew the bill on 4 September, but refused to concede the other 4 demands. Exactly 1 month later, she invoked the emergency powers to implement an anti-mask law. To counterproductive effect, confrontations escalated and intensified, police brutality and misconduct allegations increased, while some protesters started using petrol bombs and vandalizing pro-Beijing establishments and symbols representing the government. Rifts within society widened and activists from both sides assaulted each other. The storming of the Legislative Council in July 2019, the deaths of Chow Tzz Lok and Luo Changking, the shooting of an unarmed protester, and the sieges of 2 universities in November 2019 were landmark events. After the conflict at Chinese University and siege of the Polytechnic University, the unprecedented landslide victory of the pro-democracy camp in the district council election in November and the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020 brought a little respite. Tensions mounted again in May 2020 after Beijing's decision to promulgate a national security bill for Hong Kong before September. This was criticized by many as a threat to fundamental political freedoms and civil liberties, ostensibly enshrined in the Hong Kong Basic Law, and prompted some in the international community to re-evaluate their policies towards Hong Kong, which they deemed as no longer autonomous. The approval ratings of the government and the police plunged to the lowest point since the 1997 handover. The Central People's Government alleged that foreign powers were instigating the conflict. Although the protests have been largely described as leaderless, the United States passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act on 27 November 2019 in response to the protest movement. The tactics and methods used in Hong Kong inspired other protests in 2019. The Fugitive Offenders and Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters legislation and Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Ordinance to establish a mechanism for case-by-case transfers of fugitives, on the order of the Chief Executive, to any jurisdiction with which the city lacks a formal extradition treaty. The inclusion of mainland China in the amendment is of concern to Hong Kong society. Citizens, academics and the legal profession fear the removal of the separation of the region's jurisdiction from the legal system administered by the Chinese Communist Party would erode the one country, two systems principle in practice since the 1997 handover. Furthermore, Hong Kong citizens lack confidence in China's judiciary system and human rights protection due to its history of suppressing political dissent. Opponents of the bill urged the Hong Kong government to explore other mechanisms, such as an extradition arrangement solely with Taiwan, and to sunset the arrangement immediately after the surrender of the suspect. The 2019-20 Hong Kong protests came 4.5 years after the Umbrella Revolution of 2014, which began after the decision of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress regarding proposed reforms to the Hong Kong electoral system, which were largely seen as restrictive. However, the movement ended in failure as the government